Hello and welcome back to Simple Times Studios, where I share adventures and solo roleplay for your entertainment. Now that the session prep is out of the way, we are starting a solo campaign with the RPG Astroprisma by Crescent Chimera. Enjoy part 1 of Titanium Joe's adventures. The light was blinding. Titanium Joe knew hyperspace travel would be disorienting, but he didn't know it would be anything like this. His ship, the Crimson Rose, was surrounded by a blinding aura of light that seemingly changed to every color the human eye could see. Red, blue, green, yellow. It kept changing on and on until suddenly it faded. It faded, and all that was left was the warm light of a reddish-yellow sun he was in a stable orbit around. As the residual energy of the hyperspace jump completely vanished, the Crimson Rose's internal systems began running automated system checks and preliminary sensor sweeps with a series of electronic beeps and chirps. Green text began to scroll across the bridge's chunky monitors as system checks reported back positive, and the Oracle navigation system started to load a blank hexagon grid on the computer screen in front of him. Solar radiation was currently well within safety standards. It would be days before the ship was soaked in a lethal level of radiation, and he would be long gone before then. The Crimson Rose had successfully jumped into a new system. The hexagon system map was blank, of course. His sensors had a limited range, and the system was not in any data archive he could find before he escaped, but that was a fair price to pay for being able to pull it off at all. To be able to escape to a new system where he could start again. As the hexagon navigation grid finished loading, numbers began to appear on each hex, starting with 1 and ending with 36. All of them blank and waiting for him to see what was waiting for him. Unfastening himself out of the pilot's seat, he climbed to his feet and started walking around his ship to inspect the cargo and stretch after having been essentially confined to the bridge for an unknown amount of time. It was strangely hard to maintain a good sense of time in a pocket dimension where relativity no longer applied, and time didn't seem to apply either. Checking the ship's hold and his equipment locker, he looked over what he had escaped into this system with. He had his trusty modified laser blaster, a quick little energy weapon that had saved him many times in a life that was hopefully light years behind him, and a carbon dagger that might be handy in a pinch. A trio of flash rounds, a single Stardust soda, 2 med kits, and 50 units of spare parts. This and a pair of special packages was all he had to make a new life for himself in this unknown system. Collecting his weapons and putting them on his person, he then took out the 2 special packages and hid them in the ship's cargo hold. It wasn't foolproof, but it would be safer than trying to hide the brick-sized contraband packages on his person until he was absolutely certain he had a buyer. Even if he did have a buyer, unloading 2 packages of the Reno family's special recipe was a dicey proposition. Still, that was a problem for later. Right now, he needed to get back to the bridge and start exploring this system. There had to be some kind of civilization in this system, right? Returning to the bridge, Joe sat back down in the pilot's seat and headed northeast to Hex 1 on the navigation grid. Time to see what he got himself into. Alright, we're going to move to our first hex on the inner ring. I think for now I'm just going to explore the entire inner ring before moving outwards. Joe has 19 fuel left, and now we see to roll what he encounters in that first hex. A 6 on my D6. I encounter a settlement right off the bat. Rolling a D10 to see who owns it. 9 says it's the Synth Arch faction. So this is their stronghold. I don't have any money, I can't unload the contraband packages here, and I still have plenty of fuel, so I think I'll pass for now. Maybe I'll come back once I finish this ring. Almost immediately arriving in the area, the Crimson Rose picked up the beacon of a nearby settlement. Unable to believe he stumbled upon signs of civilization this early, Joe focused his ship's sensors to triangulate the location and pick up any open channels. Almost immediately, the ship was filled with the sound of binary chanting and advertisements for cybernetics and remotely controlled drones. The Synth Arch. Joe didn't know much about them beyond that they were transhumanists and that they were led by sapient androids, if rumors were to be believed. Beyond that, well, at least it looked like the settlement was open for trade. Shame he didn't have a credit to his name or anything he could sell off for some quick capital. Saving the settlement's location to his map of the system, he resolved to keep that information in mind for later and flew southward to Hex 2. Okay, for Hex 2 we're down to 18 fuel, and I rolled a 4 on my encounters table. I get an inner ring event, I get even, so it's a Helios farm. And I get a 1 on the Helios farm event table. Interesting. A swarm of interconnected rhomboid solar panels form a vast star-shaped Helios farm in front of the Crimson Rose. On its edge, several starships wait in line to refill their power supply. Seeing that there was a line forming for otherwise free fuel, Titanium Joe got his ship in queue and put his feet up on the console after configuring the ship to notify him if anything interesting happened. No sooner had he done this than the ship's computer chirped angrily. A small trade ship was on the approach, raising the digital flag of the Corsair Syndicate as it tried to contact him on a discreet channel. Waking back up with a start, Joe quickly opened a channel as he started to reach for his blaster on reflex. Crimson Rose to unknown ship. Identify yourself and state your intentions. Greetings, traveler. Interested in saving a little time? We can refuel your ship at a slight cost. You understand, right? The pilot of the other ship answered evasively. But Joe still understood. It was a simple Corsair scam. Load up on fuel and offer impatient spacers a chance to fuel up for a price that was usually less than what settlements charged, but was still higher than free and still involved money that he did not have. Granted, the line was looking longer than he first thought, and the time he was spending was going to deplete the energy of his personal capacitors, but wait a moment. Sorry, stranger, I don't have the serum, but if you're going to flash your colors like that, can you direct me to your settlement? Joe asked over the channel. But the Syndicate fuel scalper had moved on the moment he heard that Joe didn't have any money. Shrugging his shoulders, Joe turned back to waiting for his turn in queue and quickly recharging his ship's power supply when it came up. When his ship was fully charged, he flew off in the southeast towards Hex 3. Alright, we're back to 20 fuel, but down to 15 personal energy. Since Titanium Joe doesn't have any programs, drones, or cyberware that uses energy, I'd say that's a fair exchange, even though I wish I was closer to empty. Let's roll up our next encounter. I get 3 for a faction encounter. 7 says it's ISF. I'm neutral with them right now, so let's roll for a neutral encounter. And I get a 5 on the neutral encounter. Okay, I can work with this. Warnings of an anomalous energy reading screamed inside the helm of the Crimson Rose as Joe was alerted to several bright flashes of cyan light. As he flew closer, he found the source. A Ballard transporter belonging to the Intersolar Federation was having trouble with a malfunctioning engine from the look of things. Almost immediately, the ISF ship began to hail the Crimson Rose. Hey, Spacer, this is Captain Quinn of the ISF Goodhall. We need help fixing our engines. Can you assist? An audio-video message projected over the open channel. Quinn was a slender man with jet black hair and bright green eyes that looked a little young to be a freighter captain. If Joe had to guess, Quinn wasn't much older than he was. Goodhall, this is Joe of the Crimson Rose. How can I help? We need someone to go EVA and pull the warp drive from our engine. That should reset the system and allow us to move again. Okay, sounds easy enough. Is there a reason why your ship can't do it yourselves? Joe asked. I'm the only one on board, Quinn replied. Joe resisted the urge to smirk. Easy to call yourself the captain of a ship when you were the captain of one. All right, give me a minute to get suited up. This shouldn't take too long one way or another. Titanium Joe replied before he pulled his ship alongside the good hull and left the bridge to get suited up. A few minutes later, he was out the airlock and floating towards the good hull. A tether of hyperdense fibers was his only connection to his own ship. Another moment later, Joe was walking along the hull of the ISF transport towards the incompatible warp drive. He went over in his head what he needed to do, and he got set up in front of the warp drive. Removing the drive device was easy enough, but it was a fairly fragile component. He needed to be careful. Okay, it's asking me to roll for vigor. Rolling vigor. And I completely stomped this dice roll with a total of 11 on my roll and a 4 on the challenge roll. Grounding himself against the hull and powering down the erratic component, Joe made sure he had a firm grip on the device before giving it a good pull and yanking it out effortlessly. Holding the massive weightless device in his hand as he stood up in the negligible gravity of space, he radioed the ISF ship back. All right, I removed the warp drive. Did that help? Yes, everything is resetting. I can move again as soon as you get back to your ship. Man, you must have nerves of titanium to take care of that, Quinn replied. Okay. What do I do with this incompatible warp drive device? Joe asked. Keep it, and I'll make sure to mention you to my superiors. The Intersolar Federation never forgets those that help us rebuild civilization, Quinn replied. Joe returned to his ship, and the two parted ways soon after. It wasn't long after Quinn left that Joe realized he forgot to ask the ISF captain where his faction's settlement was located. A pity, as something about what Quinn had said seemed to stick with the gunslinger. Shaking his head, he continued on, heading northwest towards Hex 4. Alright, Joe gains a warp drive and +1 reputation with the ISF. He continues on his journey to explore the inner ring. He's back down to 18 fuel as he enters Hex 5. I roll 1 for a hostile encounter. I roll 4 for mercenaries, and a 2. Looks like I'm getting into a fight with a snowstorm delta. The Hex appeared empty at first, just an endless stretch of star-studded void. Then suddenly a snowstorm delta starship flies up right beside the Crimson Rose. Almost as if the pilot was trying to get a good look at Joe's face through the Rose's cockpit. On reflex, Joe opened a general frequency. Unidentified snowstorm delta. You're flying a little close. Identify yourself and state your business, Joe radioed the other ship. Nothing but silence. A few seconds passed and the ship broke away before turning around and approaching Joe on an attack run, narrowly missing his ship with a burst of particle cannon fire. And now we roll for starship combat. I'm going to roll Grace for myself and roll Action to determine turn order. Titanium Joe and the Crimson Rose get a 13 total, and the unidentified Snowstorm Delta gets a 6. I go first, so I roll my 2 action dice and get 2 2s. I use my engine's special ability to re-roll one of them and get a 4. If I understand the rules right, this means I can activate the repair drones, which I don't need yet, and fire off my particle cannons, dealing 3 damage and getting a +1 to damage on my next attack, which stacks. So I evade and take a shot. The other ship has 17 hull points left. Joe slid into a controlled dive and quickly turned around, lining up a shot and firing at the attacking ship. Big mistake, buddy. Big mistake, he muttered as his first shot connected and damaged one of the wings. Now it's the other ship's turn. I roll 2 8s on the action dice, which means I get double damage buffs on my next attack this turn. And he doesn't get an attack this turn. Whoever this pilot was, they apparently didn't expect Joe's ship to have teeth or a pilot that knew his ship inside and out. The rival ship attempted to get a target lock on the Crimson Rose twice as the pilot fought to evade Joe's retaliation, failing to follow up with an attack both times. Joe's turn again. Again, I roll 2 action dice and get 2 2s. I might need to switch these dice. I use my hover propulsor's ability again and get a 3. I fire my particle cannons again, doing 4 damage this turn, and will do 5 next time I attack. The other ship has 13 hull points left. Lining up his target again as the 2 ships continued to dogfight in the empty void, fighting in the endless night like a pair of savage canines. Joe fired another blast from his particle cannons. The energy weapon burned hotter as it continued to send even more hyper-accelerated energy into the enemy ship. Looks like Joe had the upper hand so far. Okay, the enemy ship's turn. Roll my action dice and came up with 2 4s. Double tap with the Snowstorm's own particle cannons. 7 damage altogether, take me down to 13 hull points. They also have a +2 buff to damage on their next attack with the particle cannons. The Crimson Rose rocked as the enemy pilot spun around and fired 2 bursts with his particle cannons while still flying backwards. Joe was shook inside of his ship as he tried to evade the unexpected blow. "Not a bad trick, buddy. Don't expect it to work twice," the wiry gunslinger mumbled as the flicker of a smile crossed his lips. Now it's Joe's turn again. I get 2 6s on my action dice. The one time I don't need 6s. I re-roll one of them and get a 3. I hit the enemy ship for 5 damage with my particle cannons. It has 8 hull points left. Joe returned the attack with one of his own particle cannons continuing to glow brighter the more energetic they became. The particle burst gouged a long streak against the other ship's body. Titanium Joe didn't have time for this. "Hey, idiot! How about you run away and I forget I saw you?" he radioed the other ship. Okay. Ask the Oracle. I'm going to ask the Oracle, does the enemy surrender? I roll a no, and I roll again and get the theme oppression. I think I know how I can make this work. "You think you can just walk away from family, Doug? The Reno family never forgets," came the voice on the other end. Joe raised an eyebrow. Well, that unfortunately answered 2 questions. Not only was the other pilot not going to back down, but unfortunately Joe could not let him live. He braced himself for the other pilot's next move. Okay, it's a Snowstorm Delta's move. I roll my 2 action dice and get a 4 and a 6. Another double tap with the mob pilot's particle cannons. He does 11 damage total. I have 2 hull points left. I need to get out of here. Warning klaxons go off in the Crimson Rose as multiple systems short out and Joe takes heavy damage. He had no choice. He had to run or else he was dead. Okay, attempting to escape combat. I need to roll Grace and beat a challenge die +2. I beat his 9 with a 13. Seeing that he was outmatched, Joe quickly set an escape course and gunned the engines as fast as they would go. Routing power away from weapons and other non-critical subsystems, he poured it all into the engine. He fled northward, towards Hex 5. Hopefully there was a place to rearm and finally turn his fortunes around. If there were members of the Reno family already in the system, then things were not going to be as peaceful as he thought. Okay, we are in Hex 5 with 17 fuel and a 2 hull point ship that is currently held together with duct tape and sheer force of will. Okay, 5, finally found a planet. 5 again, it's a void planet, which means it's corrupted by some sort of void energy, whatever that means. Rolled again, it's a corrupted Aquarian world, a water world. Rolled a 1 for the landing area. And the planet's name is Thera, according to my roll on the random planet name table. Narrowly escaping the Reno family assailant, Joe arrived at the next hex in the system navigation grid and caught his breath. He was going to have to deal with that ship sooner rather than later. The family could not learn that he was here. He needed a place to hide long enough to repair his ship. Fortunately, the hex seemed to have a solution. Ahead of him was a blue planet that shone like a sapphire in the endless night sky. The name Thera appeared on his system map, a byte of data given to his ship's computer by the system's forgotten data network. The atmosphere was tainted with a strange purple hue he wasn't familiar with, but otherwise the planet was habitable, according to his ship's barely functional scanners. Definitely habitable enough that he could lie low and maybe try to repair his ship. Going down through the planet's atmosphere for a landing, Joe found a group of small rocky islands streaked with algae. Completely unremarkable except for the nearby shipwreck somehow beached in between the rocky islands. Not the best landing site, but it will do, and maybe there was something that would help repair the Crimson Rose in the bones of that wrecked ship. Landing his battered ship and walking out onto the planet's surface, he took a deep breath of the salty air and adjusted his coat to keep out the early morning chill before he started walking towards the shipwreck. The algae and constant moisture made the rocks incredibly slippery, forcing him to keep an eye on his footing lest he slipped. Is there anything of value in the shipwreck? Let's ask the Oracle, and at a 2 on a D6 we get a no. Okay, after that I'm going to roll on an event and press my luck a little further. Activating a shoulder lamp worn over the synthetic fibers of his duster, he walked into the rusting metallic husk of the wrecked ship. At one point the ship was a passenger transport of some kind, rows of small rooms that were once sleeping tubes for travelers. Exposure to the extremely humid atmosphere of the planet had corroded the hull and the internal conduits, making them worthless. There was nothing here he could use to fix the Crimson Rose. Shaking his head, he left the wreck and returned to his own ship. Pulling out a toolkit, he made the repairs he could and tallied the ones that would require a proper shipwright. He could get the Rose flying again, no problem, but he would need to visit a settlement like the Synth Arch one he stumbled upon earlier if he wanted to get the ship in any shape to fight. Okay, and I previously rolled a 1 on the event table for this planet. I get wave after wave. The roar of the ocean had grown considerably louder as Joe raced to finish the repairs he could make. When he pocketed his multi-tool and looked up to check his surroundings, it was too late. A particularly massive wave had crashed with the tiny island he stood on and washed him off and into the ocean. Next thing he knew, he was off his feet and in the ocean. Completely surrounded by water, he turned to swim back to the small rocky island that the Rose was daintily perched on. But before he could reach it, the tide rose dramatically and a current started to pull him away from the rocky islet. Time to roll vigor. I got a 10 on both my player and challenge die. Not sure how that would work, but since I have a +2 to vigor, that brings me up to 12, so I guess I win, barely. At least I don't have to take any damage and get a +1 to hyperdrive. Swimming frantically, his arms and legs burning from exertion, Joe is able to drag himself back to the island. Water runs off his clothes as he is completely soaked, but the synthetic smart fibers slowly began to dry and wring themselves out. Fluid dripping off his clothes as he slowly staggers back on board the Crimson Rose. Okay, that was enough fun for one planet. Launching the ship, he takes off for Hex 6 to the northeast. It is either that or take a route directly through the sun's orbit. Both of them would take the same amount of time and fuel. Okay, for Hex 6, I roll a 2 for a neutral encounter. I roll again and again. 2 for derelict ships and 3 for the type of derelict. Joe has 16 fuel left. He was just about to write this sector off as empty when his sensors pinged from a ship idly drifting through space. Curious, Joe flew towards it and soon came upon an old asteroid drilling ship. The white and brown paint had become discolored and faded after years of exposure to hard radiation and micrometeorites, but the ship otherwise looked intact enough that there might be some valuable salvage left on it. Docking with the drifting ghost ship, Joe slipped into his spacesuit and boarded the asteroid miner. The interior was dark from years without power. The vacuum of space leaked in and made the ship completely silent as Joe stomped around and searched the abandoned ship for anything of value. After a few hours of searching, all he found for his trouble was 50 trade units of serum in a storage locker, a bridge with an absurdly complicated control system, and an old-fashioned, hardbound instruction book with the title Comment pat piloter un vassal spatial. Joe looked at the book thoughtfully before setting it back down where he found it next to the control panel. Well, that sounds like it might be helpful. Shame I can't read a word of French. Pocketing the serum, he returned to his ship. A few minutes later, he was heading back towards the Synth Arch settlement. Not how he hoped his journey around the inner ring would go, but still better than it could have been. Okay, Joe and the Crimson Rose leave Hex 6 with 50 serum and 15 fuel left. He returns to Hex 1 and the Synth Arch settlement with the intent to refuel and repair his ship. Having completed a revolution around the inner ring, Joe returned to the Synth Arch settlement. Soon the open channels were filled with general communication chatter, binary chants, and advertisement for cybernetics and remote-controlled drones. Requesting docking clearance from traffic control, Joe started to guide the Crimson Rose into an open docking bay as he talked with traffic control. "Greetings, Spacer. State your name and ship name for the record," an androgynous electronic voice asked Joe over the radio. "Joe Henderson, captain of the Crimson Rose," he replied automatically and tried not to think back to the encounter with the Reno family enforcer calling him Doug. That was a situation he was going to have to deal with at some point, but not now. Identification noted. Welcome to Ursa Scarab. The traffic operator greeted as the Crimson Rose was gently guided to a dock. Ursa Scarab? What kind of random name is that? Titanium Joe thought as he finished docking and got off his ship. First order of business was getting his ship repaired, then getting it refueled, then seeing what else there was to see here. Okay, Joe's ship is fully repaired. He spends 3 credits per unit of fuel to fully refuel for 15 credits. He has 35 credits left. Ursa Scarab was an O'Neill cylinder built inside an asteroid that had drifted into the inner ring. The space between the asteroid shell and the colony proper was studded with small automated hangars. Joe was surprised to discover that while refueling cost him credits, repairing his ship did not. Given how banged up his ship had gotten in that last encounter, he's more than willing to pay market rates for topping off his reserves. As his ship was getting repaired and resupplied, Joe decided to explore the colony and see what he could learn about the Synth Arch. Ascending to the colony living area, Joe wasn't sure what he expected, but it wasn't what he saw as he exited the colony lift. Ursa Scarab was a heavily urbanized colony home to a broad variety of cyborgs and androids milling through its streets, including types that Joe hadn't seen in years and models he didn't think were possible. Sleek androgynous humanoids devoid of any defining features walked the streets and bid him good afternoon with a soft electronic voice. 4-armed cyborgs splitting their attention between fixing small gadgets and talking to customers while they worked. Genuine artificial intelligences briefly appeared on monitors as they traveled the colony's information network. It was a world that was as familiar as it was alien. It made his skin crawl. He couldn't think of a reason why as he briefly explored the colony before starting to head back to his ship. But the obsession with robotics and cybernetics just felt too much. Like there was a line he didn't want to cross, but for the life of him he couldn't figure out where that line was or why. Still, he needed friendly ports as he explored deeper into this system, especially if things were going to be as hostile as they already were. Still, with nothing to buy and reluctant to get involved with the synth arch, Joe returned to the Crimson Rose and started the pre-launch checklist. Soon he was underway again. Might as well track down that one pilot before he could talk to too many people. End of chapter.